Hey, what's up, podcast? Hope you're keeping safe. We have a real special guest this week. I think you guys will love her. She's the owner of Forum Community Relations here in Calgary. It's a Calgary-based consulting company dedicated to promoting and creating space for meaningful engagement. She's an expert in Indigenous Relations. She's worked with over 60 Indigenous communities, organizations across Canada on economic development, community engagement, training, and education. She loves people. She loves people's stories. Talk about building connection, how to build connection, and that crazy transition from 9 to 5 cushy job to going on your own and trying to learn the ropes of entrepreneurship. Well, I hope you guys really enjoy it. Once again, email me if you have any feedback. I really appreciate it. Your feedback is gold to me. My email is joe@codessa.io, and enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Anne.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Jump right into it. So tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of your origin story, how you became to be where you are today.
For sure. So I was born and raised here in Treaty 7 territory in Calgary. My heritage is Welsh and Swedish. Ancestors arrived east coast of Canada and central Ontario back in the 17 and 1800s, but I was born and raised here and grew up kind of a middle-class white girl, not knowing much about Canada's history with Indigenous peoples. And so I had an opportunity when I was in university to do some volunteer work with Indigenous youth on some of the reserves in and around Calgary and in an urban context as well. And from that experience, I learned that there's this whole part of Canadian history that most Canadians don't know a whole lot about. And that we've got sort of a real opportunity in front of us to build relationships with Indigenous and all Canadians. And so that sort of sparked an opportunity for me to learn more. And as I explored what career opportunities there might be, I discovered that there was this emerging field of Indigenous and community relations at the time. And so just did a lot of reaching out, coffee chats, talking to people, worked to get into that field in the energy sector. So I spent a dozen years working in the energy sector for Shell, Petro-Canada, and finally at Suncor. But also along the way, sort of kept this passion growing for working with communities in a lot of different volunteer spaces. And actually had a side hustle in the consulting space for about 10 years before last year, actually, I made the jump to resign from my position, my cushy full-time position, and take the plunge to start a consulting practice doing this work. And still do some consulting back with Suncor, but also have the opportunity to do a lot of work with other governments and private companies, nonprofits, really just helping to build that capacity for improved relationships with Indigenous peoples.
Very cool. Just for our listeners, just to give them a little bit more context, what exactly is Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action?
Yeah, for sure. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was struck in 2007, 2008 in Canada is when it started. And really it was to look into understand the history, the truth of residential schools as a government policy. So for over a century in Canada, our government sponsored Indian residential schools. And so those schools were compulsory so kids didn't have a choice, parents didn't have a choice for many, many decades to remove them from their homes and have them in these institutions. Where and then documented a lot of abuse and just sort of that intention of assimilation and sort of taking the Indian out of the child was sort of the, I guess, talking point behind the intent. And so with the government apology in 2008 for those schools, this commission was struck to hear the stories, to document the evidence of what happened and sort of that history of colonization in our country that, as I said, many Canadians don't know. And then in 2015, the commission released its report, which had 94 calls to action. So those are specific calls to Canadians. They're not, they're for Indigenous Canadians, but for the most part, they're for all of Canada in terms of what needs to be done or what could be done to change our systems in order to address the wrongs of the past, to create a better future forward, where prosperity doesn't in this country doesn't relate to your heritage, I guess, which is kind of where we've been in the past.
Absolutely, yeah. I think building that bridge amongst Indigenous and all Canadians is very important. Stepping back into your career, what were some of the things you wish you had known when you first began your career journey?
Fair enough. I was thinking about in high school, my mom sent me to this career counselor, and he did all these personality tests. And what, those sort of, you tick off all the different boxes, and then it tells you want to be a plumber or something. For me, it said you're going to be an entrepreneur, was what these career counseling tests revealed. And I was so frustrated at the time because I said, of what? Like, what am I going to invent? What am I going to do that? What is an entrepreneur? And sort of cast that aside and built my career based on my passion and what I was most interested in, and where I saw an opportunity to learn and grow. And so I think when I sort of reflect on that, and of course now being an entrepreneur, I never could have foreseen that. I never knew this was a thing that I could own a business, consulting and helping supporting organizations and leaders to strengthen their relationships with Indigenous peoples. And so I think the advice would be to not focus on labels. That really you're guided by the work that you do and what you can offer, and it doesn't particularly matter what it's called or what title you have. As long as you're doing good work, that's recognized, and that's what will drive you.
Also having that passion as well, I think that's a big driver.
For
That's really
sure.
cool. What's a big challenge? It could be a current challenge or a challenge you faced in the past. What did you learn from it?
I think when I think about sort of challenges in navigating my career is along the similar lines of not not necessarily needing to fit into a box. So I think for a number of years, after I got over not necessarily knowing what it meant to be an entrepreneur, um, I I bought into sort of that corporate space of climbing a ladder, right? Like we talked about climbing the corporate ladder, and so how do you move up in an organization? These are all terms that people use frequently, and and a number of times I sort of had to take a step back and go, but is that what I want? Is that like what? Why would we want that? And I think from the entrepreneur space, again, I constantly sort of have messages of growth, and this growth and climbing and up, and bigger is better. And I think just really keeping the focus on what's important to me. And so for me, the opportunity to have my own business is more about balance and harmony and contribution, for myself, as you said, having that passion and just being able to make that contribution and feel good about what I do, rather than building an empire. So I think just that challenge of the messages that we receive, and I guess typical business messaging, and really having that focus on what's right for me, because growth is absolutely right for some people, and climbing that ladder and that next step up is what is fulfilling and what people want depending on where they're at. But just really having that challenge to focus internally on what's right for me, and to keep that, I think has been tough, and I'm trying to stick with it.
Yeah, a lot of our listeners either have their own business or have a side hustle. But how did you find the transition from the corporate ladder climbing to having your own business?
Yeah, I think I mentioned, that my side hustle started about 10 years ago, and very much was on the side, was sort of a couple facilitation or workshop or training gigs a year. So I wasn't particularly building that actively, until probably the last 2 years, I'd say, before I actually made that transition. And and had watched some colleagues and some friends who had also made that transition, and sought their advice. So I think that's number one, is learn from others. So understand people who are working in a similar space, and the similar type of business, and sort of learn what's tricky for them, and how you might be able to avoid some of those pitfalls, or what you might want to do differently. For me, my business is relationships. So my reputation follows my personal reputation in being able to work effectively with organizations and with communities is my business. And so that was a really important part for me, that in order to be able to have that credibility and to get contracts, when I went out on my own, was establishing those relationships, years before I actually was available to work on my own. And so really taking that thoughtful approach of laying the groundwork, of building the infrastructure for business development before actually leaving. I think a lot of consultants get really excited and they have something to offer, and so they go out and quit their job, go out and into the world, and find that it can be really tricky to chase contracts, especially if you're cold calling or just submitting proposals. And so really building that network early, or having that business development strategy uh, figured out before launching was important. And then the other thing that I did was um, had arranged a couple of contracts that are sort of a monthly basis. So sort of the deal I have with my family is there's this one contract with a nonprofit that I have that is basically for me equivalent of EI. And so I was on maternity leave at the time and went, okay, well, if we can make it work with just this as a baseline, then everything else is gravy. And so that took a lot of the pressure off. Just having that consistent contract took the pressure off from that constant business development chase that I think a lot of consultants feel, the need to always look for more contracts, always secure more business. Just knowing that, okay, I'm good enough where I am, and now let's just put this out into the world and see what comes from it. And it's been a great experience to sort of have word of mouth come and find me for different things pop up with different partners or colleagues I've had along the way, and really have that opportunity to grow and build. I'm going to say on my terms.
Absolutely. What would you say your? It seems like you have lots of go-getter mentality, like many other entrepreneurs. But what would you say is like a unique skill that you have that's helped you become successful in your endeavors?
So I've had this a couple of comments recently from colleagues about the way with words that I have, or I guess sort of the way that I am able to take complex subject matter like Canada's history with Indigenous peoples, and reframe it into ways that are more easily relatable or easy to understand, and then do something with. And I credit, and people have said, "How where did you learn how to do that?" And I'm thinking about it. I'll admit I was a debate nerd in high school and university, so I did debating a lot. And I think that for me really trained up sort of that think on your feet, listen on your feet, pay attention to what people are saying, and then quickly be able to sort of reframe that so that people can understand. Because we learn through story. And I think those are the points of connection. And so to be able to take heavy subject matter and reframe it in a story that makes it more approachable, but still sort of real and connected is something that I'm learning isn't super common.
Yeah, speaking about stories and interesting insights, has there been anything you've read recently or listened to that's really inspired you?
Yeah, I'm just finishing reading the book that came out last year from Jody Wilson-Raybould, so a former Minister of Justice and Solicitor General. And the book's called From Where I Stand. And it's a collection of speeches that she gave over I think about 7 years. But basically presenting a concept for how to reimagine Canada on with a recognition of Indigenous rights as was originally intended when settlers came to Canada, and a bunch of treaties were written that sort of said, "Hey, we're going to share the land together, and nobody's interests are going to take priority over the others, and we'll figure this out jointly as sort of equal nations," which of course isn't what happened over the last 150 years. But sort of it's a roadmap or a bit of an idea of how that might look in the future from where we are today. And it's been inspiring for me to sort of think of, oh, okay, there are some practical ways out of it. The how and how likely is it and what's the appetite for it is a bit up in the air, and will only come if Canadians buy in to it, I think.
Mhm.
But yeah, the ideas are inspiring. It's always exciting to me to read about and think about tangible steps that we could actually take to make progress.
Yeah, I read about, I guess, on your website that you're a serial volunteer, and I think it's very inspiring when people in our community really go above and beyond or try and connect and build community. Has there been, or is there any nonprofits or initiatives that you'd like spotlight or feature?
For sure, and I think volunteering has been just such a tremendous opportunity for me to connect and learn with community. I think in working as a settler in the space of Indigenous relations, I'm very aware of my background and privilege and the dynamics that that brings. So learning from and walking with Indigenous community partners has been super important for me. And I was very honored to be invited to volunteer to support the Indigenous Gathering Place initiative in Calgary. And so, little plug to Google indigenousgatheringplace.com. And so this is a grassroots Indigenous led community initiative to have a space, a physical space for Indigenous people to gather and connect in language, in ceremony. We have over 500 places of worship in the city of Calgary, and not one of them is intended for or geared around Indigenous spirituality and ways of knowing and ceremony. And so that's a huge gap. And you mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's one of the calls for action is for municipalities to establish spaces for Indigenous peoples to gather and connect with ceremony and with elders, and to share those ways of knowing, as well as with all Canadians. And so having that space is um, just, I think, would be a tremendous opportunity and necessary for Calgary as we find our way through what reconciliation means for us as a city being in the territory where we are.
Speaking of Indigenous relations, is there, or I guess from the top of your mind, is there a common myth or something about Indigenous relations that you want to debunk or put to bed?
Ah, there are all the myths. There's so many. Um, I think, well, and as I say, like, so many myths and misconceptions and stereotypes related to Indigenous peoples and their experiences, and contemporary realities. I think just our education system has done a complete disservice to our society, and is getting better. And I think I have a young son in grade one, and the amount that he's learning is very different from what I learned when I was in grade one, and the tone and type of information that he's getting. But I think the most common assumption, I guess, that I hear referenced in the media or in casual conversation is that they're all the same, I guess, is how I'll put that in quotes, or that there is an Indigenous point of view, or what does the Indigenous community think about this. And in Canada, we have over 700 different Indigenous groups. So there's 643 First Nations, plus Métis and Inuit communities, and organizations. And so each of those has distinct language, distinct protocols, distinct history, ways of governing, and sort of family structures, and just there is tremendous diversity within the Indigenous peoples of Calgary, or of Canada rather. And so think of it as a unite or European Union, for example, that you wouldn't say to somebody from Italy, like, well, you're just European, that you're the same as somebody from Greece or somebody from France or somebody from England formerly. Um, and yet we do that with Indigenous peoples in Canada, and there is tremendous diversity. And I think that's just the biggest thing to highlight is, if you've met one Indigenous person, you don't know them all. And to not come with that assumption that you heard your friend's friend said something about Indigenous people, and so that must be true. Just it's complex, and there's a lot to be learned, and that's what I love about it, and think is just, I'd encourage humility and curiosity, from all Canadians to continue to learn and take each situation as it comes as a unique individual circumstance.
Absolutely. Being a person of color myself, the diversity is a key issue when it comes to whether it's race relations or what you're saying, Indigenous relations. Do you think there's any effective solutions to that myth or problem?
Yeah, I think it's so a lot of it's attitude, right? Like a lot of it is just coming from a place of humility and curiosity rather than a place of um, like privilege and arrogance. And I think that can be tough for people like in our, especially in the business world, we are not used to saying we don't know things, or that we don't understand. And so that's a bit of a shift, a bit of vulnerability, that people can approach with. And again, I think that genuine curiosity, I think as Canadians also, we don't want to offend. So we often, we won't say anything or we won't ask the question because we don't want to offend people. And I think we need to be okay to ask a question that might have some language that's a little bit off, or sort of rub somebody the wrong way, if it's asked with that authentic intention to learn and that authentic desire to learn. And really the answer to it all in my mind is education and relationships, right? Like it's a lot harder to generalize about a group's experience when you've had a one-on-one conversation and looked into somebody's eyes and sort of felt the emotion of their experience that completely counteracts the stereotype. So I think it is that relationship, and it is creating those spaces like an Indigenous gathering place, where people can comfortably connect, because it can be kind of uncomfortable, the whole race thing. But we need to try. We need to be vulnerable. We need to be willing to step into those spaces.
Building relationships definitely does help put some of the stereotypes and politically incorrect stuff to bed. And stepping back into your career, what advice would you give someone wanting to pursue a career in Indigenous relations or generally being an entrepreneur?
So I think building your network is a big part of it, and I know the networking sort of view can have sort of a lot of connotations with it too. But truly, it's building, it's reaching out and getting to know people, and getting to know their story. Like that's something that is easily done, especially through, we can now do it through LinkedIn and just make those genuine connections, and understand what you have to offer others. And also in the space of Indigenous relations, I'd say build your knowledge. Like I will never know everything there is to know in this space, or if I ever thought I did, it would change tomorrow. And so recognize that the more you know is and the more that you can articulate and explain is hugely important in working in this particular space. And then the last piece I'll say is whether, regardless, whatever venture folks are getting into, is to follow up. I mean, the number of people who I've talked to, sort of interested in a career in this space, or interested in sort of taking an action to build their own business, and there's that sort of intention of following up or sending something back, and then you never hear from them again. That tells you everything. And so I think there's been fewer people who have actually followed up when they said they would than those who haven't. And so I'd say learn how to follow through and follow up, and that will serve you well in pretty much any venture you take on.
Just a few more questions here, Anne. How has Calgary changed from when you first started to now?
It's bigger. It's growing. It's grown. That's for sure. But I think it's and I think a bit of this is just how is our world changing, is an increase in polarity, and just sort of, I mentioned it can be tricky to be vulnerable and stay curious, about people with different experiences than us, and I think we've lost a bit of that. And are a bit more willing to just say you're either with us or against us, or it's this or it's that. And so one of my volunteer roles as well is as a board member with the Calgary Chamber of Commerce. And one of the programs that's really promoted through the chamber is that we need to be having and conversations, that we can talk about energy development and environmental sustainability, and it doesn't have to be an either or. We talk about the economy and the environment. Um, and that can be tricky to figure out those balances and trade-offs, but those are the conversations we need to be having. And I think we've kind of gone into a bit of a rabbit hole with the downturn in the economy. We get really defensive, and so it's an either with us or against us kind of thing, and just really shifting our language from or to and. I think is going to be really helpful and important to maintain our resilience and optimism coming into whatever is next for our city.
What in particular are you curious about, though?
How much of this COVID sort of the COVID shifts, I'm going to say, or pivots, like the things that are changing in our world, how much of that sticks once we have a vaccine and in a couple of years get sort of back on track? And so, ways of working digitally. Um, I do a lot of training in my work, and so I'm delivering a virtual course right now with people from across Canada. And so I'm really curious how much the pandemic will have accelerated change in the way that we work together, and even our attitudes about how we convene and how we connect with people. So the sort of the digital and virtual side of it, but then also just curious about are we just doing this right now, or are we forcing ourselves into trying new things and innovating, and will we actually accelerate some of that change?
Do you have any initial gut reactions to those questions?
It's interesting, like, thinking about I read an article, or there was a study on, I think it was about a quarter of people who typically work in offices and are now working from home. About a quarter of the people would prefer to stay working from home. And so I think things like that it's probably not everybody, and but there are probably some people for whom that would be a better work environment. And so will companies recognize that, oh wait, we can actually make these accommodations for diverse needs, for diverse workers. And I think it presents a lot of really great opportunities for flexibility and inclusion. Back to our earlier conversation about recognizing sort of diversity in different groups, but from a workforce perspective, I think for many organizations, it can be helpful to go, oh, well, there are different ways of working that are more effective in some cases, and maybe less effective in others, but really forcing us to try things, I think, will have a positive impact.
Yeah, I think we're all looking for what the new normal is going to look like at the other side of things. What's one question that you never get asked that you wish you would be?
I love it. That's a great question. It's an awesome one. Um, I don't think people ask me why I volunteer.
Mhm.
And it's kind of a thing that as you mentioned, it's part of my identity, and back to sort of my original story of what set me on this course of in Indigenous relations as a career path, was volunteering, was taking that opportunity to work with Indigenous youth. And I would say I've done a lot of volunteering as well with my professional association, the IAP2, or the International Association for Public Participation. So it's basically people globally who do community engagement work, not just Indigenous relations, but more broadly as well. And and I'd have to say, like, as somebody who, I think I'm mid career now, but in my early career doing that volunteering, I would say accelerated my career path like at least 5 years, maybe 10. Just in terms of the connections I made, the work that I got to do, because it was volunteer, and so it didn't matter that I didn't have experience doing it, but I got to try it because I was willing to put in the effort, and just the relationships and skills, and what I learned and who I met. So I think um, just volunteering as professional development is something I am a massive fan of, and would encourage anybody to do, and has been just a huge impact for me in my career and business journey.
For people that do want to volunteer but don't know where to start, do you have any good words of advice for them?
I think if so there's sort of a different reasons why people volunteer, but if it is that sort of volunteering as professional development, then it's great to start with your industry association, and many groups do have sort of that professional network, and are often looking for volunteers to help put on events or create communications or content. And so even just to connect and to do those pieces, that's a big win. And then there's also formerly Volunteer Calgary, now Propel Us, in the city of Calgary, that has a connection to sort of all kinds of nonprofits. And so there's plenty of nonprofits that are looking for professional skills from volunteers, that just really give you that opportunity to try stuff in a fairly safe way. I think our volunteer management has not evolved to the point where people are really used to firing volunteers, which I guess can be a good thing when you're when you're trying stuff. Um, Not as great a thing if you're in that organization and you just want to fire a volunteer. But yeah, I think it's is to do your research. There's a ton of volunteer organizations or nonprofits out there that are seeking professional volunteers, and then just ask and have that interview about what you can get from it, and the skills, know the skills that you're trying to build, and come into it with that approach. And I'm sure there's plenty of organizations that would be keen to take you up on that.
Well, thanks for the advice there, Anne. You're definitely a wealth of knowledge and lots of great insights. If our listeners want to maybe ask you some follow-up questions or just pick your brain a little bit, where can our listeners connect with you online?
So yeah, always happy to have conversation and chat further. I'm at forumrelations.com is the website, or on Twitter you can find me at Ann K Harding, and that's Ann with an E.
To end the podcast, I usually like to have the guest pose a question to the audience, or a quote or a story to leave them marinating with all the great insights.
Awesome. Well, I think the sort of a theme for me is sort of always challenging my fellow Canadians to learn more about Indigenous people's experiences in Canada, and to do that through books, podcasts, movies. There's just a ton of information out there, so not knowing is not really an excuse in my mind. To not understanding situations or being part of it. So I just sort of, what have you read recently, or what have you learned or done to increase your knowledge about Indigenous people's experiences in Canada, would, I guess, be a question. And want to end with a quote from a mentor of mine, Chief Dr. Robert Joseph. He started the organization Reconciliation Canada. And just if you find any videos online of him, super inspirational and positive, and just tremendous, just a bright light, I think, in this reconciliation journey that we're on as Canadians, and as a country. And one of the quotes from him that I love is, "Let us find a way to belong to this time and place together. Our future and the well-being of all our children rests with the kind of relationships we build today."